So the Dillian Whyte, Dereck Chisora rematch was announced yesterday. It's happening on December 22nd. Some people are disappointed because they'd rather see Dillian Whyte face Luis Ortiz or Dominic Breazeale or Jarrell Miller, etc. But as Eddie Hearn has been saying in some of the interviews that he conducted yesterday, the Dereck Chisora fight is far bigger commercially than a Luis Ortiz or a Dominic Breazeale. In my opinion, only a Jarrell Miller fight could come close to a Dereck Chisora fight commercially at this point in time, because of the fact that Jarrell Miller can talk, and although he's unknown in the UK, Jarrell Miller, completely unknown, given the fact that he talks so well, given the fact that he is such a big personality and such a confrontational character, that if you put him and Dillian Whyte together, I reckon that could sell. I mean, Dillian Whyte's going to be pay-per-view anyway, but put him opposite Jarrell Miller and you're going to get fireworks, okay? With Ortiz, you've got a guy who doesn't speak English and on top of that isn't known by the general public in the UK. And I've mentioned this before. In terms of commercial success, there's no way Luis Ortiz can do the numbers that Whyte Chisora 2 is going to do. So this was a business decision for Dillian Whyte not to fight Ortiz as far as I'm concerned. Although Eddie Hearn claims that Ortiz's people never reached out to him. They put an article out on Boxing Scene saying, yeah, we'll be willing to fight Dillian Whyte on December 22nd. But they never reached out to him, according to Hearn. They never said anything about it or, made any phone calls or emails. This is what Hearn is claiming. Be that as it may, even though me personally, and again, I don't want to have to go over old ground with regards to certain boxing polls, certain polls being put up online in terms of who you'd prefer to see fight Dillian Whyte on December 22nd. My channel is not representative of the general public in Britain. Boxing Social is not representative of the general public in Britain. I'm talking about the audience, the regulars. Michael Benson and his Twitter followers are not representative of the general public in Britain. It's representative of the boxing hardcore, and the boxing hardcore are not the majority. The boxing hardcore are a minority. For example, my channel has just under 50,000 subscribers. How many people buy Anthony Joshua pay-per-views? Millions. So if my channel or, name the channel was representative of the boxing hardcore, they'd have millions of subscribers. Even IFL, which is the biggest boxing interview platform, definitely in the UK, maybe worldwide, I'm not sure. I haven't checked their sub numbers recently. They don't have millions and millions and millions of subscribers. You have to figure that, for example, Anthony Joshua, he does over 1 million pay-per-view buys each time. That doesn't mean 1 million people are watching Anthony Joshua fight. That means 1 million pay-per-views have been purchased. And normally there's more than one person watching each pay-per-view. And then you've got the gate. So you're talking about 2, 3, maybe 4 million people watching Anthony Joshua fights. This guy's got millions of fans. Even beyond that, beyond the people who buy his pay-per-views, there is a whole army of women out there who just follow Anthony Joshua's Instagram, for example. So Hearn actually made a good point in saying that social media is not real because it's like an echo chamber. It echoes back to you what you're interested in. Because people you follow are going to be people who have similar interests to you. That's why you're following them, right? So let's say you like gardening. This is what Eddie Hearn, the example he gave. Let's say you like gardening. Well, you're going to see loads of social media posts about gardening and you're going to end up thinking, wow, the whole country loves gardening, when the reality is, no, the whole country don't love gardening. It's just you're following hardcore gardeners, right? Same thing with following all these hardcore boxing YouTube channels and Twitter accounts, etc., that's not representative of Joe Blow on the street. Yeah. And Joe Blow on the street is far more likely to know who Dereck Chisora is than know who Luis Ortiz is. This is just the reality of the situation. Now, if you want to call that a duck, go ahead and call it a duck. That's your, that's your prerogative. It's all good. As far as I'm concerned, a duck is a duck, whether you do it for financial reasons or whatever. But where there's some ambiguity in this situation is the fact that Ortiz's people never even reached out to Hearn, according to Hearn. They just put a post out on social media. And to me, I think it's potentially likely that Ortiz was just used as a negotiating tool. Because Dereck Chisora, according to Dillian Whyte, was being difficult in negotiations. Eddie Hearn says the negotiations have been difficult. So, he perhaps used Ortiz and said, look, I'm going to go fight Ortiz. If you don't want to fight me, if you don't want to make this money, I'll go fight Ortiz. So perhaps that was, as I say, a negotiating tool in order to force Dereck Chisora's hand. Whatever the case may be, as much as I would have preferred to see the Ortiz fight, and I've been on record and said that, the Chisora rematch is not a bad fight. There is some intrigue there. Now, what's interesting to me is this David Haye situation. All right. I'm going to talk about a few things here, people, in regards to this fight. But the David Haye situation is interesting because, as you can see on the little logo there, on the banner behind them, David Haye is co-promoting this event. And if he's co-promoting the event, that would seem to suggest that he is now Dereck Chisora's promoter and not just his manager. Why has Dereck Chisora chosen David Haye to promote him as well as manage him? And is it just going to last for this fight, or is it going to be an ongoing thing? That's a question I have. Now, some people have suggested, well, you see, Eddie Hearn don't treat his fighters that well because why would Chisora leave him? Dereck Chisora has been with 4 different promoters in his career, if he is indeed in a promotional deal with David Haye now. He's been with 4 different promoters. Frank Warren, the Sauerlands, Eddie Hearn, and now David Haye. 4 promoters. So him changing promoters is like you changing your underpants or your socks. He's done it regularly. It's not a big deal. It's not necessarily a damning indictment of one particular promoter. Maybe it's a damning indictment of all promoters. Yeah. But one thing I can say about Hearn, and look, I've got no affiliation with Eddie Hearn. People keep on saying, you're being paid by Hearn. Eddie Hearn has never paid me a penny. I've never talked to Eddie Hearn in my life. I've never talked to, as far as I'm aware, anybody from Matchroom in my life. But when you look at the way Eddie Hearn treats fighters, I'm not saying he's a saint, but it's better than the old generation of promoters used to treat fighters. People like Eddie Hearn, Golden Boy, these new generation of promoters are treating fighters better than the old generation of promoters. And I'm including Al Heyman in that. Even though Al Heyman is not officially a promoter, he treats fighters way better than the old school guys used to. And some of the practices, the questionable practices, which I'm talking about in terms of the old school promoters, it's whereby so many old school promoters will sue fighters or threaten to sue fighters who leave them. Or where old school promoters, when they have some kind of dispute with a fighter, they will keep the fighter out of the ring for years, or sometimes the fighter chooses to stay out of the ring because of the legal dispute and it not being able to be resolved. Examples would be when Andre Ward had his legal dispute with Goosen Tudor, I forget how you pronounce it now, but you know, the Joe Goosen, Dan Goosen promotional company. When he had his fallout with them, you hardly saw Andre Ward fight, and it was very damaging for his career. Another example would be Mikey Garcia when he had his fallout with Top Rank. He was out the ring for 2 years. You don't see that going on with Eddie Hearn. You don't see fighters getting shelved like that. Another recent example would be Gervonta Davis's fallout with Mayweather. He's been shelved, effectively. You see? And, he's a new school promoter too. But that Gervonta Davis Mayweather situation is very personal, from what I understand. Very personal. I've talked about this on my Patreon. I don't want to talk about it here because it's pretty deep. But those are the kind of practices, suing fighters, not allowing them to leave, tying them down, and just generally stifling their careers. I mean, you look at Artur Beterbiev with Yvonne Michelle. He wants out of that situation. Okay, and it's getting very ugly there. It's all ending up in court. When have you seen Eddie Hearn in court with a fighter? When have you seen a long, protracted legal dispute with a fighter? When fighters want to leave Hearn, and of course they leave. Fighters leave every promoter. Fighters leave Al Heyman. Fighters leave, name the promoter fighters have left them. When Carl Frampton left Eddie Hearn, was there a legal dispute? No. When James DeGale left Eddie Hearn, was there a legal dispute? No. When he left Frank Warren, actually, I can't remember if there was a legal dispute when he left Warren, but there was certainly threats of legal action when Tony Bellew left Warren. There was certainly threats of legal action when many, many fighters have left Frank Warren. But when it comes to Eddie Hearn, fighters leave. O'Hara Davis left. Was there any legal dispute or legal? No, he just left. As I say, when Carl Frampton left Eddie Hearn, no problem. But when Carl Frampton recently left Cyclone, Barry McGuigan's promotional company, it was a problem and it went into court. It turned into a legal matter. You see what I'm saying? So with regards to Dereck Chisora, he looks at David Haye's success and he thinks, I want a piece of that. Dereck Chisora is a very unusual man. He's got a very unusual mind and he thinks outside the box. Sometimes, and perhaps usually, his thinking outside the box leads him to make terrible decisions. But occasionally, it might lead him to make an inspired decision because, again, he's an unconventional thinker. He's not thinking in ways that most of us would think. So, a fighter hiring a former opponent who beat them to come and help them is not unprecedented in boxing. It's happened before. You may remember Matthew Macklin, for example, hired Jamie Moore, a guy who'd beaten him. He hired him to train him. So this is not unprecedented at all. The reason why it was so unusual is because up until very recently, David Haye and Dereck Chisora have had beef. I mean, earlier this year, they were beefing. Earlier this year, there was bad blood. David Haye broke Dereck Chisora's trainer's jaw when they had that brawl at the press conference in Germany. He broke his jaw. Don Charles's jaw was wired shut for several weeks and he lost, several stone in weight. So I know some people forgive easier than others, but just to give you an insight into, how serious this beef was between these two. Now, David Haye, as we all know, is a great salesman. And at this press conference, Dillian Whyte was applauding David Haye when he started giving the sales pitch for how Chisora is going to win. How Chisora has managed to transform his body, transform his training habits, transform his life, and he's going to be a brand new fighter. He's going to go all the way to the top, etc. Dillian Whyte bursts out into applause and said, Haye's a great salesman. You got to give it to him. Because many times in his career, he's been able to sell ice to Eskimos and sand to Arabs, so to speak. That's how good a salesman he is. That's how good he is at, I guess, conning the British public, some would say, fooling the British public. To be 100% fair to David Haye, as well as being a great salesman, he has been a very, very good fighter for British boxing. There's no question that David Haye, in the dark ages, really, of British boxing, was a beacon of light. especially as a cruiserweight, David Haye was fantastic. And there was so much excitement surrounding David Haye fights. So we have to give him credit where credit's due. It wasn't all bad with David Haye. A lot of people like to make out it was all bad. It wasn't all bad. He brought a lot of good too. It's just the big step up against Klitschko didn't go right. And towards the end of his career, when his body was riddled with injuries, he was trying to make out as though it was the new improved Haymaker 3.0, when in reality, this was a shell of a man, or a shell of a fighter, should I say. But his association with Dereck Chisora is interesting to me. How much of a difference will it make? Is this a desperate move by Dereck Chisora? And again, just to go back on the whole promotional situation with Chisora and Hearn, they haven't fallen out. There's Dereck Chisora with Eddie Hearn laughing about that infamous Instagram clip where Eddie Hearn had his pants pulled down. On Instagram, Dereck Chisora and Hearn laughing about that. So there's no beef or bad blood or anything like that between them. Because I know the Wilder fanboys would obviously love to use that as a stick to beat Eddie Hearn with. But I'm just aligning myself with the truth, aligning myself with the facts. If there was beef between Chisora and Hearn, I'll be talking about it. I'm not going to be sweeping it under the rug. I'll be talking about it. If Eddie Hearn has done Dereck Chisora badly wrong somehow, I'm going to be talking about it. I'm not going to be sweeping it under the rug, just to be clear about that. Okay? I've got no allegiance to Hearn. If his organization crashes and burns, as long as there's another organization to replace it, which is equally as good in terms of the way it treats fighters, then I don't care what Hearn does or where Hearn goes. It's of no interest to me. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. David Haye selling Dereck Chisora as this improved fighter now that Dereck Chisora is listening to him and taking all his advice as far as how to train, and David Haye is handling the marketing of the situation. Now, it's interesting actually that there's a contradiction between what Dillian Whyte is saying and what Eddie Hearn is saying with regards to David Haye's involvement. Because when Eddie Hearn was asked, I think in this interview here on Boxing Social, about whether David Haye's involvement in the negotiations helped or hindered the situation, Eddie Hearn says it probably helped, because it helps to have a cool head come in and put and inject some common sense into the proceedings. But Dillian Whyte said the exact opposite. Dillian Whyte said that as soon as David Haye came in, it started messing things up because Haye wanted to put a bunch of his fighters on the card. And that just started messing up the negotiations. So perhaps it's an apparent contradiction between Dillian Whyte and Eddie Hearn. Perhaps one of them is being economical with the truth, or perhaps they're talking about two different things. Perhaps Eddie Hearn's talking about it made the negotiations easier in terms of what Dereck Chisora's demands were. Maybe David Haye told him, you need to chill on this or chill on that. But maybe it made the rest of the card more difficult because Haye wanted all his fighters on the card, or a lot of his fighters on the card, and that introduced a new hurdle in the negotiations. Whereas maybe the demands of Chisora had been suppressed a little bit, Haye's demands in terms of the good of his promotional company became a new hurdle. So yeah, again, perhaps there's no contradiction. Maybe they're just talking about different things. But as far as how I see this fight going, and this was an interesting press conference, by the way. For those of you who haven't seen it, I do recommend it. It is pretty interesting. There are some funny moments. It was interesting seeing Mark Tibbs and Chisora's trainer, Don Charles, have a little bit of back and forth. That was interesting. That was funny. Don Charles, by his own admission, is a very emotional character. And he didn't seem to see the funny side in what Mark Tibbs was saying. Mark Tibbs, he says he wasn't trying to, play mind games in one of the interviews that he did when he was asked about his comment where he said he's glad that Dereck Chisora's got a compassionate man in his corner in Don Charles. That's, mind games there. That's a little banter. That's a cheeky little comment there from Mark Tibbs. All in good fun, all tongue in cheek. That's the way I took it. But Don Charles wasn't laughing. Don Charles, very serious. Didn't see the funny side of it at all. He's a very tightly wound character, Don Charles. Emotional and a bit sensitive. And his final comment to Mark Tibbs or to Dillian Whyte is that your trainer's not very intelligent. I'm not going to make no comment on... I don't think... Let's just put it this way. I certainly don't think Mark Tibbs is any less intelligent than Don Charles. At the very least. Do you understand what I'm telling you? So a bit of an ironic comment there from Don Charles in my view. As far as Dillian Whyte and Chisora, Dillian Whyte did talk about, he said, I feel sorry for your family or something like that to Dereck Chisora. And that nearly sparked Chisora off. A guy who says he's now a born-again Christian and he's turned his life around and he's forgiven people and all this kind of stuff, including his former rival David Haye. That nearly sent him back to his old ways, flipping tables and all that kind of thing when Dillian Whyte mentioned his family like that. It reminds me of the line from Menace to Society where the store owner says, I feel sorry for your mother. Some of you remember the old school movies. You remember that line. But yeah, it kind of reminded me of that. And Dereck Chisora probably wanted to go off, but he didn't. Now, I actually see this fight being better than the first fight. And it's not because of what David Haye is saying. It's not because of what Eddie Hearn is saying. It's not because of what the fighters are saying, necessarily. I just feel like it has to be better than the first fight. Unless Dereck Chisora tries something crazy, like boxing on the back foot. Then I'm anticipating this is going to be better than the first fight. And you never know with Dereck Chisora. He's a very unusual man. He's got an unusual setup with David Haye. For all we know, he's going to come out with cane rolls. David Haye's shorts on, trying to fight like David Haye. Dereck Chisora is so strange that something like that can't be totally out of the question, because Chisora is such a weirdo. All right. I'm not expecting that to happen, but you never know with this guy. So I'm anticipating Chisora is going to come forward and apply a lot of pressure. Where he went wrong in the first fight is that he couldn't sustain the pressure, because whenever he backed Dillian Whyte up, he was having a lot of success. But he was only able to do it in spurts, and then he was on the ropes, countering similar to how he was against Carlos Takam. In the rematch, he needs to apply a lot more pressure. I'm not saying that he shouldn't go on the ropes and do the countering. That's his new trick these days. Earlier on in his career, you'd never see Dereck Chisora throw counter punches. But now he's added this counter punching ability off the ropes to his arsenal. And he's used it to fairly good effect, actually. I'm not saying he's not going to do that in spurts or here and there. I think he will, but I think we'll see a lot more sustained pressure from him. And that will add and, create a better fight. And I think Dillian Whyte is going to be better in this fight. I think Dillian Whyte trusts his stamina more than he used to, because he'd been the distance in fights prior to fighting Dereck Chisora, but he'd never been the distance in a tough fight. He went the distance with Dave Allen, but that was at a canter. That wasn't a hot pace. He'd been several rounds with Ian Lewison, but again, that was not a particularly hot pace. The Dereck Chisora fight was the first fight that he went at a really, really hot pace, 12 rounds. So I think he wasn't quite sure of his stamina at that point. But since then, he's been 12 rounds with Hellenius. He's been 12 rounds at a very good pace against Joseph Parker. Had a spectacular KO win over Lucas Brown. So I do think Dillian Whyte has improved. Technically to some extent, but more mentally and physically. I think he'll be in a better place stamina-wise and confidence-wise, knowing he can go 12 hard rounds. He's done it before. He's come through crises before. He's been down. and got up to win, as he did in the Parker fight. So I think it's going to be a better version of Dillian Whyte, more sure of himself, more willing to step on the gas and press home any advantage he feels he has. And I think Chisora is going to be fitter. Chisora is going to come to win. And I was kind of just starting a point earlier, which I didn't manage to finish. And that was that, is Dereck Chisora teaming up with David Haye a sign of desperation from Dereck Chisora? Is it a sign that he feels like he's at the last chance saloon? Is it a sign that he feels like what he did first time around is not going to be good enough? I mean, evidently on the judges' scorecards, it wasn't good enough, but there was a lot of people who felt Chisora did enough to win the fight, okay? Perhaps hiring Haye, he thinks he needs to go above and beyond in order to secure the victory in this fight. You know, so it was interesting hearing Dillian Whyte say a couple things about the David Haye situation. First of all, he said, David Haye, now you're working for me. I used to spar you when I never had any amateur fights, when I was a nobody. And, you know, I used to look up to you and think, wow, you're the man. You're doing it in the boxing game in the UK. And now you work for me. You know, David Haye is co-promoting Dillian Whyte's event. I guess that's what it means by that. The promoters are employed by the fighters. Another thing Dillian Whyte said is that Dereck Chisora is on a worse deal now than when he was working with Eddie Hearn as a promoter. Dereck Chisora is paying David Haye as a manager and paying him as a promoter. Now, I don't know what the percentages are off the top of my head, but there is a standard British Board of Boxing Control percentage that a manager gets and a standard percentage that a promoter gets. David Haye's taken both of those from Dereck Chisora. Dillian Whyte, for example, is self-managed. Nobody manages him. He only pays the promoter's fee to Eddie Hearn, but he doesn't pay a manager's fee to anybody. He's self-managed. Whereas Dereck Chisora is paying out fees for both, and he's paying them to his old foe, David Haye. Now, I don't know how Dillian Whyte knows that Dereck Chisora is on a worse deal now, because before he hired David Haye, he had Steve Goodwin as his manager. So he was still paying out a manager fee and paying out a promoter fee to Hearn. So I'm not sure how Dereck Chisora will be on a worse deal now than he was when he was with Hearn. I don't know. Maybe, you know, I'm not doubting what Dillian Whyte is saying. I'm just saying I don't know. I don't get it. Maybe somebody can explain it to me. Maybe Dylan in some interview somewhere has explained it further. And if he has, please make me aware of it. But yeah, it just seems as though Dereck Chisora thought to himself, who better to help me improve at this stage of my career? Not only in terms of the money, because he sees the way David Haye has managed his money and promoted himself, but as a fighter, who better to help me improve than somebody who's beat me? Someone who has looked at me, looked at my weaknesses, planned on how to beat me and executed it. I need that guy because he's going to help me improve on my weaknesses. It's kind of the thinking of Lennox Lewis when he got knocked out by Oliver McCall. For that fight, Oliver McCall was trained by Manny Stewart. And so very shortly after the fight, to Manny Stewart's surprise, he got a call from Lennox Lewis. And Lennox Lewis was like, I want you to train me. You're the guy who engineered my downfall. And so therefore, you're the perfect guy to fix all the problems that I've got as a fighter. That was the logic behind it, and it is very logical. But just because you know what a guy's weaknesses are and how to exploit his weaknesses, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know how best to utilize his strengths. Those are two different things. Okay? Minimizing his weaknesses, sure, but utilizing his strengths, different. Utilizing his strengths will come down to obviously training methods, how you're getting him to train, and also tactics. So the proof is in the pudding at the end of the day. And the David Haye element of this equation does interest me. If Dereck Chisora had chosen anybody else to be his new promoter and manager, I'd be confidently picking Dillian Whyte to win this rematch. I mean, I confidently picked him to win the first fight, and although he did win, it was a lot tougher than I thought it would be because Dereck Chisora showed up. I thought Dereck Chisora would sleepwalk through the Dillian Whyte fight, kind of like how he did against, who's that Turkish guy that he lost to? I forget the guy's name now off the top of my head. The guy that he fought in, was it Monaco? God, I've forgotten the guy's name. But yeah, I thought that Chisora would sleepwalk through the fight. I thought that the fire had gone in Dereck Chisora's belly going into the Dillian Whyte fight. So I thought Dillian Whyte would have a pretty easy time of it, to be honest with you. The fact that it turned out to be so turbulent for him did surprise me. I didn't expect that. I didn't think Chisora had that much fire left in the tank. But going into this rematch, I'm doubting Dereck Chisora again. Maybe to my detriment. But the one thing which is making me question my judgment a bit here is the inclusion of David Haye. David Haye is the wild card in this situation. If he wasn't involved, I'd be picking Dillian Whyte strongly. And I know Dereck Chisora had that spectacular KO of Takam, but what preceded the spectacular KO was Dereck Chisora getting beaten from pillar to post by Takam. Yeah, Takam was well ahead in that fight. Takam was beating Dereck Chisora up. After the fight, Dereck Chisora was talking about how strong Takam was and the fact that he couldn't stand in the middle of the ring and trade with Takam because the guy was too strong for him. Dereck Chisora him and his trainer were constantly banging on about how strong Takam was and it was the toughest fight. Dereck Chisora said that was the toughest fight he's ever been in. Dereck Chisora has lost multiple fights. He lost to Tyson Fury. He got knocked out by David Haye. He lost to Vitaly Klitschko. He's lost lots of fights. But the toughest fight, which wasn't even his longest fight, he says was the Takam fight. He took a beating in that fight. That's why the knockout was so spectacular and memorable, because it came totally against the run of play. So when I look at that, when I look at the beating Dereck Chisora took, and look, I know that Dillian Whyte and Kolas Takam are two different fighters. But when I look at the beating that Chisora took, and when I look at how much he was resting on the ropes, I just felt like Chisora at this point is having to try and fiddle his way through fights. He's having to try and old man his way through fights. Can he really fight for a sustained pace for 12 rounds anymore? We haven't seen him do it for a long time, not even in the first Dillian Whyte fight. Can he do it? He says he's a changed man now and this, that, and the other. David Haye says when you see him on the scales, you're going to be shocked. I'm looking at Dereck Chisora at the press conference. I'm looking at all his interviews. Look at his neck there. Dereck Chisora, to me, does not look like he's in career best shape. The best shape I can remember Dereck Chisora being in was in the run-up to or at least aesthetically, the best shape I can remember him being in was in the run-up to the Fury rematch when he was taking on people like Gerber and Parler. That's when his weight was really low. He was looking really slim and trim. He nearly had a six-pack at that point. But that's not the way Dereck Chisora looks here to me now. He don't look anywhere near that trim. So is this really going to be a guy who can turn back the clock and start fighting for 3 minutes of a round for the best part of 12 rounds again? Like he did against Vitaly Klitschko all those years ago. I don't know, man. I'm not convinced at this point. So I'm still edging towards Dillian Whyte winning this fight, but not with 100% confidence at all, because of how the first fight went and because of the inclusion of David Haye. But I do think that Father Time is undefeated, and the punishment that Dereck Chisora has taken, including in the Takam fight, is going to take its toll on him. But everybody is not the same. Dereck Chisora is a very unusual man, and unusual men produce unusual behavior and unusual performances. And I mean that in a good way a lot of the time, not just in a bad way, but also in a good way. An unusual man can produce a career best performance when you didn't think he had it in him. So will Dereck Chisora be able to do that and defeat Dillian Whyte here? And again, it has to be said that Dillian Whyte didn't have to take this fight. Dillian Whyte didn't have to take any risky fight on December 22nd. He could have just waited it out for April, whatever it is, April 13th, is it? They're looking to have Anthony Joshua's next fight. Dillian Whyte could have waited it out, but he's taking on Dereck Chisora in the rematch. I think for financial reasons more than anything else. He likes the fight, but I think the financial reasons are the priority. And below that would be developmental reasons as a fighter. And also, if he's able to beat Dereck Chisora in spectacular fashion, it helps to build the Anthony Joshua fight even more. And it helps to show how much Dillian Whyte has progressed. So, yeah. Anyway, lengthy video here, people. You'll have to forgive me. Shout out to everybody who's seen it through to the end. The last thing I want to talk about is the face-off between the two guys. It appears as though Dereck Chisora is taller here. Now, having David Haye in his corner now, not as a trainer, obviously, well, I guess as an advisor, as a training advisor, but officially as a manager and promoter, you might see some funny games being played by Dereck Chisora. And one of the funny games, for example, that Vladimir Klitschko played on several occasions against numerous, several different opponents, is he would wear platform shoes, or he would put lifts in his shoes to make himself taller. And Vladimir Klitschko is already a very tall man, but this was a psychological tactic to intimidate his opponents, to make them feel like, okay, you're up against a much bigger man. And this is nothing new in boxing. Back in the days, Sonny Liston, for example, when he would attend weigh-ins and when he would come to the ring, for the time he was already a big heavyweight, but he would put towels underneath his boxing robe to make himself appear bigger. And I'm not just talking about the towel around his neck, I'm talking about even under his boxing robe to make himself appear bigger, his body appear bigger. This is what Sonny Liston would do. It's a psychological tactic. And so is putting lifts in your shoes to make yourself appear taller. Is that what Dereck Chisora has done here? Because Dereck Chisora is at least an inch shorter than Dillian Whyte. If you saw them in the ring, that was evident. He's at least an inch shorter than him. Probably closer to 2 inches shorter than him. But here he appears taller than Dillian Whyte. Maybe it's just the angle of the camera, because you can see the backdrop there is slanted. So perhaps it's the angle of the camera. Or maybe, as I say, Dereck Chisora has got lifts in his shoes, because he appears like significantly taller here. And we know that he's not. I'm probably going to get some people arguing with me now that he is taller than Dillian Whyte. People love arguing about boxers' heights. That's one thing I can tell you. Somebody always tries to pull me up about a boxer's height. It's tiring at times, but, the things you go through, man, some people are such nitpickers that, they want to pick away at every little thing you say. But yeah, that's what I'll say about that. It's still an interesting fight, still a good fight, still a tough fight, still a dangerous fight for Dillian Whyte. Would I have preferred to see him fight Ortiz? Definitely. Because the Dereck Chisora fight's always going to be there, right? It's always going to be there. Even if Chisora loses, Dillian Whyte's still going to have the opportunity if he wants to. Because look how much Dereck Chisora loves money. He's going to be hanging around for a little bit if he don't fight Dillian Whyte now. So I think the fight's there. Is Dillian Whyte underestimating Dereck Chisora? That's one thing people are saying. I personally don't think so. He remembers how hard the first fight was. He knows Dereck Chisora very well. He sparred him. He saw the spectacular knockout that he scored over Carlos Takam. He's aware that that could happen to him if he leaves his chin hanging out to dry. So I don't think Dillian Whyte is underestimating Dereck Chisora at all. Not at all. I think he's expecting a tough fight, but I think he's concentrating on himself and thinking how he can improve and what things he can do to produce a better performance second time around. So yeah, I'm going with Dillian Whyte to win the fight, but I expect it to be tough, particularly if Dereck Chisora comes in the shape that David Haye claims he's going to come in. I expect it to be tough. Maybe, just as tough as the first fight. I expect it to be a very good fight. Let me know how you guys feel in the comment section below about everything I've talked about in this video. It's happening, I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.